The silence was so heavy it felt like it had a physical weight. It wasn't just an empty space. It was as if the very air had lost its will to exist. I remember that moment perfectly. No music, no conversation, no hope. Only the distant sound of a clock ticking away the time as if each beat were a sentence. It was there, in that silence, that I realized how brutally and suddenly life can change. Everything I had built seemed solid, firm, almost impossible to tear down. I believed I was in control, that every step had been calculated, that nothing could go wrong. But reality has a cruel way of showing us that control is just an illusion. Until that day, my life seemed like a success story. I had the job, the recognition, the money, and even the respect of people who admired what I was building. I felt invincible, and that sense of security made me believe that the future was inevitably bright. But fate doesn't ask if we're ready. It simply happens, and when it did, it came like an avalanche, silent at first, but devastating in the end. One mistake here, one miscalculated decision there, and suddenly everything began to crumble. It wasn't an explosive collapse. It was more like a slow erosion that went unnoticed until it was too late. The debts began to mount. At first they were small, almost negligible, but like a pulled thread in fabric, they increased until the entire cloth began to unravel. I looked at the bills and felt the weight of each number as if it were a stone on my chest. The feeling wasn't just one of loss, it was one of powerlessness. I wanted to fight, but it seemed that every effort only worsened the situation. My mind began to fail, my body grew tired, and motivation, that simply vanished. Shame took the place of confidence. It wasn't just the money that was disappearing, it was the image I had built, the identity I carried, the pride I nurtured. When failure knocks on the door, it doesn't come alone. It brings with it an army of doubts. Am I capable? Should I have done things differently? Do I deserve this kind of fall? All these questions circled in my mind like shadows, ready to attack me at any moment. And the worst part was that the failure was visible, public. It wasn't a hidden or discreet mistake. It was a disaster exposed for all to see. And people, they don't forgive easily when someone falls. They looked at me with that mixture of pity and judgment. Some avoided eye contact as if failure were contagious. Others, bolder, couldn't hold back and let slip comments that cut deeper than any direct criticism. But the most painful thing wasn't the words. It was the look. That look that says, "I always knew." That look that implies that success was never real, just a temporary illusion. That look that makes you feel you're being judged not only for your choices, but for your very existence. And then came the moment that still echoes in my mind to this day. I heard it. I heard the laughter. It wasn't a little. It wasn't timid. It was full, deep, almost proud laughter. People who had previously greeted me now allowed themselves to laugh, not directly, but enough for me to know it was about me. It was like a silent blow, one of those that doesn't cause immediate pain but leaves a deep mark, impossible to erase. And the worst part, they laughed. That sound resonated within me like a hammer, not because of the humiliation, although it was there, but because of the realization that when you fall, the world doesn't sympathize. It observes, it comments, it judges, and ironically, it celebrates the downfall of those it once admired. It seems that success inspires, but failure entertains. At that moment, my mind began to crawl into a dark place. Doubt increased, hope diminished, and the future seemed like a tunnel without light. I wondered if I would ever be able to get up again. And perhaps you, who are watching this now, have also gone through something similar. Maybe not in the same context, but with the same feeling. Because who has never felt that the world was against them? Who has never looked at their own life and thought, why does everything go wrong at the same time? Failure has a way of isolating you. It makes you feel alone, even when surrounded by people. It makes you question the value of your choices, the strength of your decisions, and even the purpose of your journey. It makes you believe that falling is the end, when in reality, it's often just the beginning of something bigger. But at that moment, I didn't know that. At that moment, everything seemed lost. It felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet, and I was suspended in an endless void. And it was there, in that crushing silence, that I realized how devastating a fall can be, not because of what you lose, but because of what people see in you when you lose. And perhaps it was right there that the real story began. When failure becomes public, it doesn't just come as news. It comes as a spectacle. And like any spectacle, it attracts spectators. People who previously didn't have the courage to look you in the eye now feel an inexplicable freedom to comment, judge, and even mock. I remember every detail as if it were a scene frozen in time, the laughter echoing in the hallways, the whispers spreading like wildfire, the expressions of surprise mixed with satisfaction. It wasn't just an isolated comment, it was a chorus that seemed to say, "We knew it." The laughter was different from the others. It wasn't laughter of joy or relaxation. It was laughter laden with judgment, in that dry, short way that conveys more than 1,000 words. It was as if each laugh was a sentence, a way of confirming failure while simultaneously transforming it into a source of entertainment. I saw people who had previously respected me now tilting their heads back, smiling, talking amongst themselves, as if they were witnessing something inevitable, an episode they had been waiting for a long time, and finally had the opportunity to see. The comments came quickly, sharply, and full of a confidence that only judgment can give. "I told you it wouldn't last. That was predictable. He thought he was somebody." Each sentence was like a small cut, thin but deep. And the worst part wasn't the content, it was the intention. It was the silent pleasure of seeing someone fall. And that, more than any negative number or material loss, hurts. Because failure, when it's private, can still be worked on. You can look at it, study its cause, reorganize your plans. But public failure, it touches the ego, the identity, the image. It exposes the whole human being. And when people start talking, laughing, commenting, it ceases to be just a mistake. It becomes a narrative that others tell, not you. You are no longer in control of history. And that is devastating. Public failure hurts more than failure itself because it goes hand in hand with humiliation. It leaves no room for silent reflection or calm reconstruction. It demands a reaction because the world doesn't give you time to breathe. Everything becomes judgment. Everything becomes opinion. Everything becomes spectacle. I saw myself in that scenario as someone who couldn't escape their own shadow. Even when I tried to distance myself, the voices continued. Even when I tried to concentrate, the laughter returned. Even when I closed my eyes, the echo remained. And at that stage of life, the mind begins to be dominated by the feeling that you are no longer seen as someone who made a mistake, but as someone who deserved liquid. And in that heavy atmosphere, where people seem to revel in the downfall of another human being, something began to change within me. A silent, almost imperceptible, yet firm feeling. A realization that stemmed neither from anger nor pride. It came from understanding. They didn't know what was about to happen. They had no idea what failure could transform when fueled by courage. While they laughed, I watched. While they judged, I reflected. While they celebrated, I built silently. The irony is that the same people who mocked my downfall were the ones who most underestimated my ability to get back up. They only saw the moment, not the story. They only saw the mistake, not the journey. They believed that failure was the end, when in reality it was just the gateway to something greater. And here's the point that changes everything. What I did next changed everything. And few people understand that. It wasn't an impulsive action. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't an emotional response. It was a cold, calculated, firm decision, a decision that required courage, discipline, and an ability to ignore the outside noise. While the world laughed, I was silently writing the chapter they never imagined. Most people think success comes from a big moment, a sudden turnaround, or an unexpected opportunity. But what truly transforms a life is the ability to remain still when everyone expects you to crumble. It's the ability to look at failure and see it as a tool, not a destiny. And in that quiet, far from the laughter, far from those comments, far from the opinions that tried to bury me, the strength that would change everything was born. They laughed because they didn't know. They judged because they did not see. They underestimated it because they didn't understand. And that's precisely why the next chapter of this story carries such great power. Because when the silence ends and the action begins, the whole world realizes that what seemed like the end was just a prelude. And that realization, that turning point, is what transforms a fall into a story. There comes a moment in life when failure ceases to be a burden and becomes an opening. A moment when everything that seemed to crumble transforms into fuel. That's exactly where I found myself. I was tired, emotionally exhausted, and yet there was a silent flame burning inside me. It wasn't hope. It wasn't pride. It wasn't anger. It was a decision so clear it almost echoed in my mind. I'm not going to play the victim. I'm going to act. When people wallow in failure, they don't realize that human beings have limits. And when those limits are reached, something changes. The mind quiets down, emotions calm, and focus ignites like a bright light in the darkness. I didn't want any more explanations, any more justifications, any more compassion. What I wanted was transformation. I wanted to change the course of history, even if it meant starting from scratch, even if it cost sleepless nights, even if it demanded extreme discipline. The decision didn't come like a thunderclap. It came like a thread of light, a small thread, but persistent. And I held on to it tightly. I understood that to reverse that situation, hope wasn't enough. Work was necessary, and real, consistent, constant work. The process began like this. First, discipline. The discipline that demands you get up when your body begs you to stay. The discipline that compels you to continue when your mind wants to give up. The discipline that transforms small, daily actions into pillars of reconstruction. It was like being in a dark room and lighting one candle at a time. The light was still dim, but each illuminated inch revealed a previously invisible path. Then came the study. I dove into the information like someone searching for oxygen underwater. I read, watched, analyzed, compared, tested. Each book, each video, each conversation was a piece of a giant puzzle. I wasn't seeking knowledge out of curiosity. I was seeking survival, and each insight I found was like a new tool in my hands. Focus then became the anchor, because focus is what keeps the ship from drifting in the middle of the storm. And there were storms. Many. People who still doubted, bills that still arrived, memories that still hurt. But the focus remained firm, like a rock in the middle of the sea. I knew where I wanted to go, even when the path seemed invisible. And the sacrifice? Sacrifice was the fuel for this reconstruction. Sacrifice of nights, of leisure, of rest, of relationships that no longer added value, of habits that no longer served me. Sacrifice of everything that didn't fit into the new version of myself. I felt like a tree being pruned. Pain, loss, but necessary to grow again. To explain what happened, I need to use a metaphor. I was like a piece of metal thrown into the fire. The pressure burned, the temperature was intense, the pain was constant. But right there, in the extreme heat, the shape began to change. And when the metal cools, it doesn't return to its original shape. It transforms. While they were talking, I was building. While they were giving their opinions, I was working. While they laughed, I grew up. They saw ruins. I saw structure. They saw an end. I saw the beginning. The process wasn't glamorous. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't inspiring. It wasn't full of lights. It was raw, intense, and silent. It was an internal battle where each day was a new test, and each small victory, a new piece falling into place. And then, after weeks that felt like months, after months that felt like years, after accumulated effort like layers of stone, something began to change. The energy in the construction began to vibrate differently. The pieces that previously didn't fit together now aligned easily. The vision that had once seemed hazy was now crystal clear. And finally, the moment that no one expected arrived. It didn't come with fanfare. It didn't come with an explosion. It came as a silent revelation, a natural turning point, the kind of moment that makes the whole world stop for a second to understand what just happened. People who previously doubted began to understand. Those who had laughed before began to ask questions. The comments have changed. Perspectives have changed. The narrative has changed. And I, who had previously hit rock bottom, was now rewriting history, with discipline, with focus, with study, with sacrifice, with courage, with a strength that only failure can reveal. And so, the turning point happened. The return wasn't explosive. It didn't come with fireworks or a cinematic moment. It was a natural, steady, and solid process. The kind of construction that doesn't attract attention at first, but when complete, leaves everyone speechless. After weeks of effort, months of discipline, and a dedication bordering on obsession, the first achievements began to appear. Small, discreet, but real. A project that once seemed impossible was now working. A goal that seemed unattainable was now being surpassed. An opportunity that previously only existed in dreams was now materializing before my eyes. The growth was visible, but not flashy. It didn't seem like a leap. It seemed like continuous progress. Like a plant that grows slowly but surely until, when you realize it, it's already big. Enough to change the entire landscape. I was no longer fighting to survive. I was building, and each step was firm, supported by a solid and well-structured foundation. The achievements started coming one after another, not because I was seeking applause, but because consistent work always leaves evidence. Results, data, proof, and when that proof starts to appear, even the most skeptical need to take a look. I didn't come back with noise. I came back with substance. I didn't come back with promises. I came back with facts. I didn't come back with emotions. I came back with results. And then came the moment that always divides stories. People's reactions. The same people who used to mock, comment, and look with that superior smile now didn't know where to look. The laughter disappeared. Not because they changed their minds, but because reality changed the scenario. And reality, when it's strong, cannot be ignored. The same corridors where laughter had once echoed were now silent. The same groups where comments used to circulate now had very few words. The same gazes that once carried judgment now carried surprise, and in some cases, discomfort. It was like watching a scene where everything changes sides. The expressions that previously conveyed "I knew" now carried the message "I didn't expect." The tone of voice, which had previously been mocking, now became neutral. Confidence in the judgment was giving way to doubt, and the most striking thing, what was once mockery was now silence. A heavy silence. A silence that spoke louder than any words. A silence that revealed the shock of realizing they were wrong, of admitting they had underestimated someone who should not have been underestimated. Silence is the most honest way to admit defeat. He doesn't lie, he doesn't pretend, he doesn't dramatize, he's simply there, and he exposes the truth. When the achievements became public, when the numbers started to appear, when the interviews, messages, and opportunities arrived, the impact was inevitable. The people who had previously laughed now found themselves facing a completely different narrative than the one they had created. And that is unsettling, very unsettling. Because it's easy to laugh at someone on the ground. It's difficult to admit that the same person is now standing and stronger than before. And then came the final revelation, a silent, yet extremely symbolic revelation. They erased everything so they wouldn't have to admit their mistake. Profiles that were once full of comments, criticisms, and opinions are now empty. Posts that once contained sarcasm, now non-existent. Content that previously reinforced the narrative of failure, eliminated as if it had never existed. An attempt to erase the past so as not to have to confront one's own image. An attempt to rewrite history so as not to have to admit the mistake. an attempt to escape responsibility for having been part of the mockery. And this, paradoxically, further demonstrated how strong the comeback had been. When success is so evident that even the critics have to be silent, you know that history has changed. The comeback wasn't just about recovering what had been lost. It was about rebuilding with more strength, more strategy, more purpose. It was about turning the fall into a springboard. It was about flipping the narrative so clearly that even the opponents were at a loss for words. And so, silently, the final chapter of The Return was written, with achievements, with maturity, with growth, with respect, with results, and with an undeniable truth. When you decide not to be defined by your downfall, the whole world needs to recalculate its perception. Every story has a moment of revelation. Not the dramatic moment, not the turning point, not the moment of success, but the moment of understanding. The moment when you look at everything that happened and realize that every fall, every mistake, every tear, and every night of doubt had a greater purpose. And it is precisely here, at the end of this journey, that the lesson becomes clear. The story you just read isn't just about someone who fell and then got back up. It's about the essence of humanity, about the boundary between giving up and persisting, about what differentiates those who stay down from those who get back up. Because failure, it doesn't define the future. Failure is just a chapter, sometimes the most painful, sometimes the most humiliating, but still just a chapter. The future is not written by mistakes, but by the attitude towards mistakes. And that attitude is more powerful than any circumstance. When everything falls apart, the world expects you to give up. When the pressure mounts, many expect you to give up. When silence weighs heavily, many believe you won't be able to go on. But it is precisely at this moment that attitude makes all the difference. Because attitude is not emotion. Attitude is not hope. Attitude is not a fleeting motivation. Attitude is a continuous, firm, and decisive action. And that's what transforms a fall into a comeback. That's what transforms pain into strength. That's what transforms shame into purpose. If you're at rock bottom today, perhaps burdened by mistakes, losses, or doubts, know that you're not alone. Many people who are now role models, who inspire, who lead, who teach, have been at rock bottom. They've felt the empty silence. They've heard laughter. They've faced judgment. They've felt the weight of public failure. But none of them allowed the chapter of their downfall to be the final chapter. And you don't have to allow it either. The fund is not a destination. It's an opportunity, an invitation to rebuild with greater awareness, a call to grow stronger, a chance to start over with more strategy. The return doesn't depend on luck. It doesn't depend on people's approval. It doesn't depend on perfect circumstances. The return depends on a decision. The decision not to be defined by the mistake. The decision to transform it into fuel. The decision to get up, even when your legs are trembling. The decision to continue, even when the mind doubts. The decision to act, even when the world is watching. Those who learn from their falls win when they return. This phrase carries a truth that few people understand. The fall itself isn't the problem. The problem is not learning from it. Falling isn't the end. The end is giving up. Falling is not shameful. Shame lies in the silence of inaction. When you observe the fall with awareness, it ceases to be a threat and becomes a tool. And tools haven't destroyed anyone. They build. Today's story clearly demonstrates this. There was no magic, no shortcuts, no improbable turnaround. There was discipline. There was focus. There was study. There was effort. There was sacrifice. There was courage. And above all, there was attitude. And the attitude transformed the entire scenario. Failure is no longer the main focus. The fall is no longer the narrative. Pain is no longer destiny. And the return became the legacy. And that's why stories like this resonate, because they reflect what we all carry inside: fear, doubt, pressure, but also strength, courage, the ability to rebuild. Life isn't about never falling. Life is about knowing how to get back up and to rise better than before. If you are struggling now, if the weight seems too heavy, if your mind is weary, if your heart is wounded, Remember, the comeback begins where despair ends. It begins the moment you decide to keep going, even when everything seems to suggest otherwise, and when you continue, when you persist, when you turn setbacks into learning experiences. The world will see, not through words, not through speeches, but based on the results. And then you can look back and understand what many only understand later. The fall didn't destroy you. She transformed you. And the return defined you. Because those who fall learn. Those who learn grow. Those who grow win. If this story inspired you, leave a like, share it with someone who is going through a difficult time, and comment, "I will be back." Because a comeback begins in the mind and ends with effort.